The sun had barely dipped below the horizon when Tom Hank received the call. His radio crackled to life. The voice on the other end urgent, clipped. "Tom, we've got a wildfire in the Sierra Madre region. It's spreading fast. Get to the base. Now." Without a second thought, Tom jumped into his truck, the engine roaring to life as he sped toward the scene. Years of experience had taught him to keep his emotions in check during such emergencies, but tonight was different. There was something about the fire, the way it burned brighter than usual, that gnawed at him. He had seen his fair share of wildfires, but this one felt different. As he neared the base camp, the sky was ablaze with the glow of flames. The air was thick with smoke, and the crackling of the fire sounded like 1,000 whispers. His heart raced. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. "Where are the hot spots?" he asked as he joined his team. "They're concentrated over by the ridge," one of the firefighters answered. "But it's spreading faster than we expected. We'll need backup soon." Tom nodded, his eyes scanning the flames. As his team moved out to contain the blaze, something caught his eye. A strange patch of land within the fire's path, untouched by the flames. It was as if the fire had skipped it entirely, a blackened world surrounding it. But this one patch of green remained intact. He frowned. The fire didn't work like that. There was no natural reason for the area to be spared, not with the way the flames were spreading. "What the hell?" he muttered under his breath, stepping closer. His team was busy setting up lines to fight the fire, and no one seemed to notice him as he veered off course toward the mysterious patch. The closer he got, the clearer it became. This was no natural anomaly. There was something there. As he entered the untouched area, the fire's roar seemed to fade into the background, as though it were a distant echo. His boots crunched against the dry earth, and his eyes scanned the ground. Then, something gleamed in the dim light. A small object, half buried beneath the scorched earth, untouched by the flames. He crouched down, brushing the ash away. It was a metal box, weathered and old, with strange markings carved into its surface. His breath hitched. "What is this?" he muttered, more to himself than to anyone around him. His hand hovered over the box, a strange sense of unease settling in his gut. This wasn't just some random object. It felt significant, like it held the key to something larger. But he couldn't explain why. He glanced back at the fire line, still burning uncontrollably in the distance. His team was too far to notice his distraction. He could feel the pull of the box, the mystery it represented, and against his better judgment, he decided to take it with him. "Hey, Tom," one of his crew shouted, pulling him from his thoughts. "You need to get back here. We've got work to do." Tom hesitated for a moment, then stood, cradling the box in his hands. His heart pounded as he made his way back to the team, trying to shake off the feeling that he had just stumbled onto something far beyond a simple wildfire. What if the fire wasn't just a disaster? He whispered to himself, a chill running down his spine. What if it's a warning? As he stepped back into the chaos of the fire zone, the world seemed to close in on him. He couldn't know it yet, but the flames were only the beginning, and the secrets hidden in that box would change everything. Tom Hanks sat alone in the small, dimly lit office at the fire station, the box now resting on the desk in front of him. His fingers traced the strange symbols etched into its surface, but the more he studied it, the more questions it raised. What was it? And why had it survived the fire? A fire that had destroyed everything in its path? The noise of the station faded away as his mind wandered. He couldn't shake the image of Lily's face that had flashed through his thoughts when he'd made the decision to take the box. His 12-year-old daughter, her wide brown eyes filled with concern every time he'd left for a fire, asking him to promise her he'd come home. But how could he promise that? How could he make any promises when he was constantly in the midst of danger? His phone buzzed, pulling him out of his thoughts. It was a text from Lily. "Dad, when are you coming home? I miss you." The weight of the message hit him harder than he expected. He stared at the screen for a moment, heart heavy, before typing a quick reply. "I'm coming soon, kiddo. Stay safe, okay?" He pressed send, but the message felt empty. He had been absent too many times already, too many fires, too many close calls. It was all part of the job, but the guilt gnawed at him. Every time he left, A small part of him wondered if it would be the last time he saw her. Tom sighed and stood up, pacing around the office. He needed to focus. The mystery of the box was eating at him, but Lily was still waiting for him at home. She was the only thing that kept him grounded, kept him going after everything he'd lost. He thought about his wife, Maria. She had been the love of his life, the one person who made him feel like everything was worth it. Until the accident that had taken her from him. A wildfire, much like the one he was battling now, had stolen her life and left him with nothing but grief and guilt. It had been years since that night, but the pain of it still lingered like a shadow over everything he did. That night, Tom had been just a few miles away, stuck in traffic because of another fire. He had heard the reports on the radio, the fire getting closer to the residential area where Maria worked late that night. By the time he made it to her office, it was too late. The fire had already swept through the area, and Maria hadn't made it out. Now, every time he saw a fire, every time he heard the crackling of flames, he was reminded of that night, of the helplessness, of the fear, of the loss. And now, with this strange box in his hands, he wondered if fate was playing some cruel game, pulling him back into a world he had tried to escape. He looked down at the box again, the odd symbols almost taunting him, as if it were connected to everything that had happened, as if it were pulling him into something bigger than himself, something that might finally give him the answers he'd been seeking for years. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. It was one of his fellow firefighters, Dave, a good friend and someone Tom trusted. "You good, man?" Dave asked, standing in the doorway, eyeing the box. Tom didn't answer immediately. Instead, he slid the box toward Dave. "What do you make of this?" Tom asked, his voice low. Dave frowned, inspecting the markings. "Never seen anything like it," he muttered. "Where'd you find it?" "A fire zone up in the Sierra Madre. It's the strangest thing. It wasn't touched by the flames, not even singed." Dave's eyebrows shot up. "What the hell? That's not possible." "I know," Tom said, his voice thick with frustration. "It doesn't make sense, and I don't like it." Dave hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Well, I'll tell you this. You're not gonna get any answers sitting around here. I'd say take it to the experts, get it analyzed." Tom ran a hand through his hair. He didn't want to involve anyone else just yet. He wasn't ready to share this. Not with his team, not with anyone. There was something about the box that felt too personal, too tied to something bigger than he could understand. "I'll handle it," he said, his tone final. "I'll take care of it." Dave gave him a look but didn't press further. He nodded and left the room, leaving Tom alone with the box again. For a long moment, Tom sat there, staring at it, thinking about Maria and the past that he could never escape. He thought about how much he missed her, how much he missed their life together, how much he wished he could go back and make things right. But as he reached out to close the box, something inside of it shifted, and the sound of metal scraping against metal made him freeze. Tom's breath caught in his throat as he slowly lifted the lid, his heart racing in his chest. Inside, nestled between the folds of ancient parchment, was a small piece of paper. It wasn't a map, like he had first thought. No, it was something more, something he hadn't expected. A letter. And as his fingers traced the delicate edges of the paper, he realized that the letter was addressed to him. Tom's hands trembled as he unfolded the letter, his fingers brushing against the fine paper, worn with age. It was strange. This was no ordinary letter. It felt like it had been waiting for him all these years, as if it had somehow known that the time would come when he would be ready to read it. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. The letter was written in elegant script, and as he began to read, a wave of familiarity washed over him. "To my descendant, who will read this in the shadow of fire, I write to you from a time long past, when the flames were born not from nature, but from the greed of men. You are part of a legacy that has long been forgotten, a legacy that has been hidden by those who sought to bury the truth of what happened to us. My hope is that, by the time you read this, you will have the courage to uncover the secrets we left behind and prevent the horrors we unleashed from repeating themselves. The fire is not just a disaster, it is a warning of what lies beneath the earth, and what mankind's greed can awaken. You must find the source. You must stop it before it consumes us all. With hope and fear, Jonathan Hank. Tom's breath hitched. He couldn't believe what he was reading. Jonathan Hank, his great-great-grandfather. The name was familiar, like a distant whisper from a past he had only heard about in old family stories. But this letter? It was something else entirely. It was a plea for help, a warning, and a message from the past that he had never expected to find. He closed his eyes, trying to process what he had just read. A part of him wanted to dismiss it as nothing more than some odd coincidence, an old piece of paper that had been tucked away in the box for no reason. But deep down, he knew it wasn't that simple. There was something more to this, something he couldn't ignore. He stood up and paced the room, his mind racing. What did his ancestor mean by the source? What was the fire really about? And why had it been hidden for so long? The fire that had claimed his wife's life, the one that still burned in his soul every day, was part of something much bigger than he had ever imagined. It wasn't just a natural disaster. It wasn't just a result of climate change or carelessness. No, it was a symptom of something far darker. A warning. Tom's fingers clenched around the letter. He couldn't ignore this. He couldn't let this be buried, not again. If there was a chance that he could stop the fires, to stop whatever his ancestor had tried to prevent, then he had to take it. But how? Where would he even begin? The question weighed heavily on him, but as he glanced back at the box, he realized that the answers were in front of him, hidden beneath layers of dust and time. The map, the letter, they were connected, somehow. But to what? There was no time to waste. The fire in California was still raging, and the idea that it could be part of something larger was too real to ignore. But as much as his mind screamed for him to act, another part of him was torn. Lily, his daughter. She was waiting for him, needing him. The guilt, the fear of leaving her behind, was like a weight on his chest. But if he didn't do this, if he didn't follow through, then everything would be for nothing. His phone buzzed again, snapping him out of his thoughts. It was Lily. "Dad, are you okay? I'm worried." Tom closed his eyes, his heart aching. How could he explain this to her? How could he tell her that he might not be coming home? He couldn't bear the thought of losing her, not after everything he had already lost. He stood up and wiped his face with his hand, taking a deep breath. He had to focus. He had to find the answers, for her, for Maria, for everyone. The letter's final words echoed in his mind. You must find the source. You must stop it before it consumes us all. Tom reached for the map, the edges frayed and torn. It was marked with a location, a place deep in the Sierra Madre Mountains. It looked like a trail, one that led to something hidden, something important. The pieces were starting to come together, but there was still so much he didn't understand. He grabbed his jacket, determination setting in. The time for hesitation was over. He would follow the clues. He would uncover the truth, no matter the cost. The drive up into the Sierra Madre was long and lonely, the road twisting and turning through dense trees and sharp mountain ridges. Tom barely noticed the scenery as he gripped the steering wheel, his mind consumed by the puzzle in his hands, the map and the cryptic letter from his great-great-grandfather. There were no clear answers, only more questions. But one thing was certain. He couldn't let this mystery slip through his fingers. Not when it was tied to the fire, and not when it held the potential to change everything. He parked his truck at the base of the mountain, where the map had indicated a trailhead. The air was cooler up here, the smell of pine thick in the air. It felt eerily quiet. Too quiet. The fire seemed like a distant memory, though he knew it was still raging far off in the distance, consuming everything in its path. Tom took a deep breath, pushing aside his anxiety and stepping out of the truck. He was already dressed for the hike, boots laced tight and gear strapped to his back. But even as he started down the narrow trail, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him. A prickling sensation at the back of his neck. He told himself it was just nerves. It had to be. He had dealt with enough dangers in his life to know when to be alert. But this felt different. The trail wound its way deeper into the forest, each step taking him further from civilization and closer to the unknown. The map was clear, but it didn't reveal much more than the general location of what Tom was looking for. There were no signs of what he might find, no clues to guide him. It was as if he was walking into an old, forgotten story, one where the ending had been lost to time. After an hour of hiking, the trail opened up into a clearing, the trees parting to reveal a series of crumbling stone steps leading up to a small plateau. At the top, Tom could make out the remains of what looked like an ancient structure. Stone walls, weathered and broken, but still standing strong. The air here felt different. The hairs on his arms stood on end as he approached. He took a cautious step forward, scanning the area for anything that could indicate the significance of the place. Was this the spot marked on the map? There were no signs, no obvious clues. Just the ruins of what seemed like an abandoned village, long forgotten by time. As he climbed the stone steps, the sense of unease grew. His instincts were telling him something wasn't right. The silence was unnerving, broken only by the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. It felt like the world had forgotten about this place. But Tom couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was still watching. When he reached the top, he found what he had been searching for. A large stone slab, partially buried in the ground. The markings on it were unmistakable. They were identical to the ones on the box. The same strange symbols, worn by age but still legible. It was as if the slab had been waiting for him to find it, as if it had been placed here centuries ago with the sole purpose of guiding him forward. Tom crouched down, his fingers trembling as he brushed away the dirt from the surface. He could feel the weight of history pressing down on him as he worked to uncover what lay hidden beneath. As the stone slab shifted, a faint rumble echoed through the ground beneath him, making him freeze. "Damn it!" he muttered under his breath, his heart pounding. He had known something like this would happen. There was always a cost when digging into the past. The fire had been one warning, but this was different. This felt like a call to something darker. With a final push, the slab came loose, revealing a dark, narrow hole beneath it. Tom hesitated for only a moment before he climbed down into the hole, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The walls were damp and cool to the touch, but there was something else, something that felt unnatural. The hole led to a small chamber, its walls lined with old carvings and symbols. The air was thick with the scent of earth and decay, and yet there was an undeniable sense of something powerful lurking in the shadows. At the center of the room lay an object, half buried in the dirt, its shape too large to make out in the low light. Tom moved closer, his breath shallow as he reached down to uncover it. As his hands brushed against the object, a shock of energy surged through him, sending a jolt of electricity up his spine. He gasped, his pulse quickening. It was as if the object were alive, its energy vibrating through the air. With a final tug, he pulled it free from the dirt. It was a large stone, a sphere, smooth and polished, with the same markings as the box. It hummed with an eerie energy, as though it held the power to change everything. Tom held it in his hands, the weight of it a physical reminder of the secrets it contained. His mind raced with questions. What was this? And why had it been hidden here? The connection to the fire, his wife, his great-great-grandfather, was becoming clearer, but there were still so many pieces missing. He took a deep breath, realizing that he had just uncovered the first part of the puzzle. But what came next? And who, or what, had been watching him? Tom's mind was racing as he trudged back up the stone steps, the strange stone sphere clenched tightly in his hand. His breath was shallow, his body tense, as though the very air around him had shifted since he uncovered the artifact. Every instinct screamed at him that he was not alone, but he pushed the thought aside. There were more pressing matters at hand, and if the whispers in his head were right, this sphere was a key to unlocking something far larger than he could have ever anticipated. The trip down the mountain felt even longer than before, the weight of the stone dragging him down as much as the doubts that gnawed at his mind. Was he in over his head? He had already risked so much to uncover these secrets. But now that he had the artifact, this stone, this source of power, what was he supposed to do with it? Once back in his truck, Tom placed the sphere on the passenger seat. He turned the engine over, the low rumble filling the cab, but it did little to quiet his mind. He couldn't go home yet. He had no idea how he would explain the sphere to Lily, or how to keep her safe now that he felt the weight of something ominous following him. His phone buzzed again. Lily. He checked the screen, hesitating for a moment before answering. Dad, where are you? You said you'd be back soon. Her voice was laced with concern, and for a moment, Tom's heart twisted. He hated putting her through this. She had already lost one parent, and now she was scared that she might lose him, too. I'm okay, kiddo. Just wrapping things up. I'll be home soon, I promise. Promise? I promise, he said, forcing a smile into his voice. It didn't sound convincing even to him, but he had to make her feel like everything was fine. For now, it had to be enough. He hung up, his resolve growing firmer. He couldn't let her down, but he couldn't ignore the truth either. The fire wasn't just a natural disaster. The sphere had to be connected to something much larger, something much darker. He was dealing with forces beyond his understanding, and the more he uncovered, the deeper the danger seemed to grow. That night, Tom didn't sleep. Instead, he pored over every piece of research he could find, using old family records, books, and online articles to try to piece together what the symbols on the stone could mean. As the hours ticked by, he found patterns, connections between his ancestors' writings, the fire, and strange, ancient rituals that seemed to reference a force, a hidden power, that had once been revered and then forgotten. He sat back, rubbing his eyes. It was all so fragmented, but he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that the more he learned, the closer he was to uncovering something the world wasn't ready for. The next morning, Tom decided to dig deeper into the history of the area. There were old legends of fires that had burned in places that defied logic, fires that would reignite after being put out or never burn out completely. Could these stories be linked to the phenomenon he had seen firsthand in the forest? The thought was chilling. He made calls, gathering as much information as he could from local historians, environmental experts, and even a few former firefighters. The more people he spoke to, the more it became clear that there was something very wrong about these fires. There were whispers of something buried deep beneath the ground, something that had been disturbed in recent years by increased human activity. But no one seemed to know exactly what it was, and everyone who had tried to dig too deep had either been silenced or vanished without a trace. The pieces were starting to fit together, but the picture it formed was terrifying. It wasn't just the fire that was out of control, it was everything surrounding it. It was as if the flames were a warning, but the question was, what was the real threat? Was it the fire itself, or something darker that it was trying to expose? Tom's thoughts turned to the group that had been following him, the same shadowy figures he had seen lurking around his investigation. He couldn't shake the feeling that they knew more than they were letting on. But who were they? What were they protecting? And why did they want him to stop digging? Then, it hit him. His great-great-grandfather's letter had said that the fire was a warning. What if it wasn't just a natural disaster or an industrial accident? What if it was something orchestrated? Something deliberately set in motion by people who understood the forces at play and who wanted to keep the truth buried? Tom grabbed his jacket, a sense of urgency growing in his chest. He needed to get to the bottom of this, but time was running out. The fire was already spreading fast, and every hour he wasted could mean more lives lost. As he headed out the door, he caught a glimpse of his phone screen. Another message from Lily. "I'm scared, Dad. Please come back. I need you." The words stung, and for a brief moment, Tom hesitated. But then he looked down at the sphere sitting on the table, its surface pulsing with an unnatural energy. He didn't have the luxury of turning back. He had to stop the fire, and he had to do it now. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the landscape as Tom drove through the dense forests. The urgency in his chest was palpable, each beat of his heart a reminder that time was slipping away. The fire, still burning miles away, was now a looming presence on the horizon. The smoke had begun to blanket the sky, turning everything a dull gray. It was an ominous sign, but Tom couldn't let it distract him. He had a mission now, a purpose that went beyond just fighting flames. He had followed the trail from the map, delving deeper into the mysteries that had been passed down through his family. But the more he uncovered, the more dangerous things became. He had known from the start that something bigger was at play, but the discovery of the stone, and the secrets it held, had only intensified the fear gnawing at him. And now, as he neared the outskirts of the old mining town marked on the map, he could feel the eyes of someone, or something, on him. It was an unsettling sensation that he couldn't shake, a feeling of being stalked. Every rustle in the trees made him tense. Every movement in his peripheral vision had him on high alert. The thought of turning back crossed his mind more than once, but there was no turning back now. The truth was too important. He parked his truck near an old trailhead, the same trail he'd walked just days before. The air felt thicker now, heavier with the weight of secrets that seemed to hang in the trees themselves. Tom stepped out, scanning the forest for any signs of movement. The quiet was eerie. There was no sound of birds, no rustling of animals. It was as though nature itself was holding its breath. He moved deeper into the forest, following the faint trail that led toward the forgotten village. The stone sphere, now safely hidden in his backpack, felt colder against his back with each passing step. He couldn't shake the feeling that it was calling to him, pulling him deeper into the heart of whatever mystery was unfolding. Half an hour into his hike, Tom spotted something that made his heart race. A figure, cloaked in shadow, standing just beyond the trees. It was too far to make out any details, but the shape was unmistakable. Someone was watching him. He froze, his hand instinctively reaching for the knife at his belt. He didn't know who these people were or what they wanted, but the fact that they had been following him since he first uncovered the stone made it clear that they weren't here to offer help. Tom's instinct screamed at him to turn around and retreat, but he couldn't. Not when he was this close. He had to find out who was behind this, who had been watching him, tracking him, and why. He crept forward, keeping low to the ground, moving silently through the trees. But the figure had already vanished. A chill ran down Tom's spine. It was like they had never been there. He could hear nothing now, only the soft rustle of wind through the leaves. His mind raced. Were they part of the same group that had been keeping secrets? Had they been watching him since the very beginning? He didn't have time to dwell on the questions. He had to move forward. He continued up the trail, his senses heightened, every sound amplified in his ears. His focus was razor-sharp, but the sense of being watched never left him. By the time he reached the ruins of the old village, the sun had fully dipped below the horizon, leaving him in darkness. The stone structures, once home to a thriving community, were now nothing more than crumbling remnants of a forgotten past. The air was thick with the scent of moss and decay, but Tom couldn't help but feel drawn to it, as if there were something important hidden among the rubble. He explored the area methodically, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. It wasn't long before he found what he was looking for, a small stone building, tucked away behind a thicket of overgrown vines. The door, made of thick, rotting wood, creaked loudly as he pushed it open. Inside, the air was cool and damp, but it was what lay on the floor that caught his attention. A series of strange symbols, similar to those on the stone sphere, were etched into the floor in a circular pattern. The markings glowed faintly in the dark, an eerie blue light emanating from the cracks in the stone. Tom knelt down, his heart racing as he traced his fingers over the symbols. This was the place. This was what the map had been leading him to. But as he studied the markings, a noise behind him made his blood run cold. The door slammed shut. Tom spun around, his hand going for the knife at his belt, but before he could react, the darkness seemed to close in around him. Shadows shifted, moving with unnatural speed. A low growl echoed from the corners of the room, followed by a voice, a whisper, barely audible. "You shouldn't have come here." Tom's pulse quickened. The shadows began to take shape, forming into human figures. They were cloaked, their faces hidden beneath hoods, but their presence was suffocating. The air felt thick with tension, the energy in the room shifting in ways Tom couldn't explain. "Who are you?" Tom demanded, his voice steady despite the fear curling in his stomach. The figure closest to him stepped forward, revealing a pair of cold, calculating eyes. "We've been waiting for you," the man said, his voice low and filled with menace. "You shouldn't have uncovered the truth. Now, you're part of it." Tom's grip tightened around the knife, but before he could react, the ground beneath his feet trembled. The walls of the small building shook, dust falling from the ceiling as if the very earth was protesting his presence. "They're not going to let you leave," the figure said, his voice now laced with a twisted amusement. Tom's heart pounded in his chest. It was clear now. Whatever he had uncovered was far more dangerous than he had imagined. These people weren't just keeping secrets. They were part of something much darker, something that had been buried for generations. And now, Tom was trapped in the middle of it. Tom's pulse pounded in his ears, but he forced himself to take steady breaths. The shadows surrounding him pressed in like a suffocating fog. He knew he had to think fast, but everything about this moment felt wrong. The cloaked figures, the eerie whispers, and the tremors shaking the ground. It was all spiraling into something much bigger than he could have imagined. His mind flashed to Lily, and for a moment, a sharp pang of guilt cut through him. He had promised her he would come back. He couldn't let her down now. The figure closest to him stepped forward again, his footsteps deliberate, the sound reverberating through the silence. "You've uncovered too much," the voice said, cold and menacing. "The flames will spread, but they're only the beginning. What you're looking for is not what you think." The last words hung in the air, a puzzle piece that only deepened the mystery. What was Tom looking for? What did the fire have to do with the ancient village and its long-forgotten inhabitants? His mind raced, but before he could respond, another tremor shook the building, more intense this time. The man in front of him smiled grimly, stepping back. "It's too late for you," he said, "but perhaps we can help you understand." He raised his hand, and the room went dark. Tom's heart skipped a beat, but he didn't have time to react. In the blink of an eye, the shadows seemed to come alive. Figures materialized from the darkness, closing in on him, and though Tom tried to prepare himself, he was suddenly overwhelmed. But before they could strike, the tremors became a full-blown quake. The ground beneath them split open, and with a deafening crack, the stone floor gave way. The cloaked figures scrambled, but Tom didn't hesitate. He bolted, running blindly through the rubble as the building collapsed around him. He could hear shouts in the distance, the chaotic scramble of people, those who wanted to stop him and those who were now caught in the madness. Somehow, Tom made it out of the ruins. He stumbled into the open air, gasping for breath. His chest burned, his mind spinning with the horrors he had just witnessed. But he couldn't linger. There was something about this village, this place, that was pushing him toward an inevitable confrontation. He could feel it in his bones. He turned back toward the forest, but a figure emerged from the shadows, blocking his path. "Going somewhere?" the voice asked, smooth and cold. It was the man who had spoken earlier, the one who had led the cloaked figures. His eyes gleamed in the moonlight, full of knowledge and danger. There was no mistaking it. He was part of something far bigger, something ancient and powerful. Tom's instinct screamed at him to run, but he was trapped. "You don't understand," the man said, his voice almost sad. "This is bigger than you. This is bigger than all of us." He stepped closer, and Tom felt an icy chill crawl up his spine. "You found what we've been protecting. And now, the fires, they are only the start." Tom's mind raced, his thoughts scattering like dry leaves in the wind. "What are you talking about?" he demanded. "Who are you? What is this place?" The man smiled, a cruel twist to his lips. "This is the last place where the earth's power still lies untainted. The village you see, the people who once lived here, they understood something that others never did. They lived in balance with the forces you're now fighting, and they paid the price for it." Tom's head was spinning. The man's words were like riddles, but one thing was clear. There was a force at play far beyond just a natural disaster. It was as though the flames themselves were connected to the very land beneath his feet. But how? "The truth is buried here," the man continued, his voice almost reverent. "It's why the fire keeps coming back. The flames are a warning, a signal from the earth itself. And now that you've awakened it, there is no going back." Tom swallowed hard, the weight of the situation bearing down on him. He had been chasing a shadow, a mystery that seemed to grow larger the more he uncovered. But this was no longer about finding the truth. It was about survival. He had to stop the fire before it consumed everything, before it consumed Lily. "What do you want from me?" Tom asked, his voice firm. The man's eyes flickered with something like amusement. You already know, don't you? You're the one who's supposed to stop it. You've awakened the forces, and now you must see them through. We've all been waiting for you. Waiting for me? Tom repeated, confusion flooding his mind. What are you talking about? You'll understand soon enough. The fire's true source is deeper than you can imagine. But there's still time, if you're willing to listen. The man's expression softened, almost pitying. But you're too far gone. You'll never stop it. Not in time. Tom's grip tightened on the knife at his belt. I'll stop it, he said, his voice a low growl. I don't care what you say. I'm not backing down. The man chuckled softly, stepping back into the shadows. We'll see. The fire will burn brighter than you can imagine. And when it does, you'll understand what we've been protecting. Before Tom could react, the man disappeared into the forest, leaving him alone in the silence of the night. Tom stood in the fading light of the forgotten village, his breath heavy as he tried to process the cryptic words of the man who had disappeared into the forest. A deep sense of unease gnawed at him, but he couldn't allow fear to take root, not now. Not when so much was at stake. He turned his focus back to the task at hand. The markings, the strange symbols carved into the ground, the stone that had led him here. It was all part of something far more significant than any fire or disaster. Tom was part of a long, untold story. His family had a role to play in this, and it was time he uncovered the truth. As he retraced his steps to the small stone building, the weight of the discovery grew heavier on his shoulders. The whispers of his ancestors seemed to echo in the silence around him. He couldn't ignore it any longer. The stone, the symbols, the strange connection to the fire. It was all tied to him. His family had known about this, had protected it. But why had they kept it secret? He reached into his backpack and pulled out the stone sphere. The faint blue glow from its surface illuminated his hand, casting eerie shadows against the walls of the village ruins. There was something about the stone that called to him, an ancient energy that seemed to pulse with life. He'd seen those symbols before. The markings on the floor inside the building, the ones that had glowed with the same eerie light. They were identical to those on the stone, the very same symbols his family had passed down for generations. It had to mean something. But what? His mind raced as he turned the stone over in his hand. There was a worn engraving on its surface, almost hidden beneath the layers of age and grime. With a careful touch, Tom traced his fingers over the markings, the cool stone sending a shiver through him. The engraving was faint, but he could make out a word, Galen. A name, Galen. It was the name of an ancestor, someone who had lived in these very mountains hundreds of years ago. But Tom had never heard the name before. He had never known of any connection to this place. What had Galen known? What had he tried to protect? And why hadn't anyone spoken of it? With trembling hands, Tom pulled out the letter he had discovered back at home. The letter from the box, the one that had set him on this path. He unfolded it carefully, scanning the handwriting that had now become familiar. The letter had been written by someone in his family, someone who had lived in the same town as Tom's ancestors. The words within spoke of a great fire, one that had ravaged the land centuries ago, a fire much like the one Tom was witnessing now. But what struck him most was the reference to the stone. The fire is not what it seems, the letter said. The flames are but a herald of something greater, a power buried deep beneath the earth, something that cannot be contained by mere men. Galen knew this. He sought to prevent it, but the power he discovered, it calls to us all. Tom felt his breath catch in his throat. The letter, like the stone, was part of a larger story, a warning. His family had known about the fires. They had known that this power was more than just a natural disaster. It was a force tied to the earth itself, and it had been unleashed again. But why? As Tom pondered the letter's meaning, his thoughts shifted back to Lily. He hadn't spoken to her since the fire had begun to rage, and the guilt was overwhelming. He had told her he would protect her, that he wouldn't let anything happen to her. But now everything felt out of control. The fire wasn't just burning forests, it was threatening everything, and he had no idea how to stop it. But there was one thing he could do. He had to learn from the past. He had to understand the role his family played in this story and what they had left behind. the stone, the map, the letter. They were all part of a legacy, a family legacy that held the key to stopping the fire. It wasn't just about fighting flames. It was about understanding the true source of the fire and stopping it before it consumed everything. The answers were here, hidden in the ruins of the forgotten village. The secrets of his ancestors, of Galen, were waiting to be uncovered. Tom took a deep breath, steeling himself. He couldn't afford to fail. Not now. Not when so many lives were at risk, including Lily's. With renewed determination, he made his way back to the building where he had found the strange symbols, and he began to study them again, looking for any clue that could lead him to the next step. But as he traced the patterns with his fingers, something caught his eye, an inscription carved into the stone. This one was different. The markings were new, added long after the original symbols had been etched. The words were in English, not the ancient script he had seen before, and they sent a chill through his spine. Only the one who carries the flame can extinguish it. Tom's hand froze. The words felt like a final warning, and yet, a strange sense of clarity settled over him. He had been chosen for a reason. He carried the flame within him, not just the fire that ravaged the land, but something deeper, something tied to his family's legacy. The fire was not just a natural disaster. It was a force of nature, a power that needed to be understood and controlled. And Tom was the key. Tom stood at the edge of the village ruins, the wind biting at his skin as the full weight of his discovery settled over him. The stone in his hand seemed to hum with an energy all its own, as though it recognized the path Tom was about to walk. The world around him felt charged, like a storm was brewing on the horizon. He had learned so much in such a short time. The fire wasn't just an environmental disaster. It was part of a much larger force, something ancient, something that had been buried beneath the earth for centuries. And now, it was waking up again, spreading across the land like wildfire, consuming everything in its path. Tom's thoughts flickered back to the letter, the cryptic words from his ancestor that had set him on this journey. Only the one who carries the flame can extinguish it. What did that mean? How was he supposed to stop something so vast, so powerful? He clenched the stone in his hand, the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. He didn't have all the answers yet, but he was closer than he had ever been. He had to keep moving forward. The fire had to be stopped, no matter the cost. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps broke through his thoughts. Tom turned quickly, his instincts on edge. He had learned to trust no one, not even the people closest to him. Tom. It was Rick, his old friend and fellow firefighter. Tom's face softened at the sight of him, but his gut twisted. Rick had been by his side through countless fires, always a steady presence, always the voice of reason when Tom's emotions threatened to take over. They had fought side by side in more than one life-or-death situation. They were more than colleagues. They were brothers in arms. But something was off. Rick's face was tense, his eyes darting nervously. The easy confidence that usually radiated from him was gone. There was a coldness in his posture, as if he were hiding something. Something important. Tom's grip on the stone tightened, and the old sense of camaraderie warred with his growing suspicion. "What's going on, Rick?" he asked, his voice low. "What are you doing here?" Rick hesitated, glancing around before taking a step closer. His voice dropped to a whisper. "I need to talk to you. It's about the fire." Tom felt a chill run down his spine. "What about it?" Rick looked around again, his eyes flicking nervously, as though checking for anyone who might be listening. "There's more to this fire than you think. More than anyone knows." His voice trembled slightly, but Tom couldn't tell if it was fear or guilt. "I didn't want to get you involved, but I—" "Rick, what the hell are you talking about?" Tom interrupted, stepping forward, his mind racing. He couldn't afford to waste time on cryptic words. "Not now," Rick sighed, his shoulders slumping as though he had been carrying an unbearable weight for too long. "It's not just a natural disaster, Tom. Someone's been manipulating it. The fire, the land, it's all connected, and I've been part of it. I didn't know at first, but now I do. And I'm sorry." Tom's world seemed to slow, the words hanging in the air like poison. His heart thudded in his chest as everything around him began to feel unreal. You're telling me this is intentional? Someone is behind it? Rick nodded, looking away, his face a mixture of shame and fear. Yes, and I've been working with them. I didn't know the extent of what they were doing, but I've been part of it. Tom took a step back, his mind reeling. Rick, his trusted friend, had been working with whoever was behind the fire? How could this be possible? It didn't make sense. Rick had always been a man of integrity, a protector of others. This wasn't the man Tom had known. You've been lying to me this whole time? Tom's voice cracked, the hurt evident. Rick flinched as though Tom's words physically struck him. No, I didn't know what was really going on. I swear. But now I do. And I can't stay quiet anymore. There's something deeper. The fire, it's not just about the land. It's about power. And I think it's something that's been passed down for generations, something that connects to you, Tom. Tom's breath caught in his throat. What do you mean it connects to me? Rick shook his head, his hands raised in a gesture of helplessness. I don't know. I was just a pawn. But now I think you're the key. You've been chosen, Tom. You're part of this, whether you want to be or not. Tom's head spun. It was too much. His mind raced with questions he couldn't yet answer. And you didn't think to tell me this sooner? When you knew what was happening, you just let it happen? I couldn't. I was scared, Rick admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. They're too powerful. They have connections everywhere. I couldn't risk my life, or yours. But now it's too far gone. The fire will only get worse unless you stop it. Tom stared at Rick, his heart torn between the friend he had known for years and the man standing in front of him now, a man who had betrayed everything they had built together. You were part of this. You knew all along, and you never said a word? Rick lowered his eyes, unable to meet Tom's gaze. I didn't know how to say it. I thought I could fix it on my own, but I couldn't. I don't want to be a part of this anymore, Tom. I'm sorry. I should have told you sooner. Tom clenched his fists, the fire burning not in his chest, but in his soul. You've already told me too much, Rick. I don't know how to fix this, but I know one thing. If you're really sorry, then help me. Help me stop this. Rick swallowed hard, a flash of guilt crossing his face. He nodded slowly. I will. I'll help you. I swear. But as Tom turned to leave, his mind clouded with the weight of the betrayal. A voice echoed in his head. Can you trust him? The wind howled through the trees as Tom and Rick trekked deeper into the mountains, their every step crunching in the thick underbrush. The weight of Rick's confession hung heavily between them, but Tom could no longer afford the luxury of emotions. There was a greater urgency now. The fire was not just an act of nature, it was a warning, and it was getting closer to the heart of the forest, where the most ancient secrets lay buried. Tom's thoughts raced as he led the way, the stone still clutched tightly in his hand. It felt heavier now, as if the stone itself understood the gravity of the situation. Every step he took seemed to bring him closer to something he couldn't yet fully comprehend, but the pieces were falling into place. What's the real story here, Rick? Tom asked, his voice calm but laced with tension. I need you to tell me everything. No more lies. Why is this fire happening? What is the source? Rick looked over at Tom, guilt and fear written across his face. His hands were trembling as he spoke. It's not just fire, Tom. It's an elemental force. Something alive. It's been waking up for decades now, and we've been feeding it, feeding the flames with our greed. The mining, the drilling, the destruction of the land. It's all been pushing it to the surface. It was only a matter of time before it broke free. Tom's eyes narrowed as he processed Rick's words. So, you're saying this fire, this thing, is a result of human activity? Rick nodded, his face grim. Yes, but it's more than just environmental damage. It's like the land itself has been corrupted. The balance has been disrupted, and now it's angry. It wants to be free, to claim the world. Tom clenched his jaw, his stomach turning at the thought. This was no ordinary fire. It was a living, breathing thing. A force of nature, awakened by humanity's destruction. And the only way to stop it was to understand it. How to appease it, or how to fight it. They reached the foot of the mountain where Tom's map had indicated something important, something that could provide answers. As they climbed the rocky path, the air grew thick with smoke. The fire was closer now, the sky above them a murky shade of orange, as if the heavens themselves were burning. Tom's heart pounded in his chest. The flames were no longer just a distant threat. They were all around him. The heat was unbearable, but he pushed forward. The source of this fire lay ahead, hidden beneath the mountain, and he would find it, no matter what it took. The path led them to a narrow cave, obscured by overgrown vines and rocks. It was difficult to make out any detail in the fading light, but Tom felt an undeniable pull, as though the cave itself was calling to him. He glanced at Rick, whose expression had shifted from guilt to apprehension. "Are you sure this is it?" Rick asked, his voice low. Tom nodded, his resolve firm. "This is where the answers are." They entered the cave cautiously, the air inside thick with an unnatural heat. The walls were covered in soot, and the ground beneath them seemed to pulse with a strange energy. It was like the cave itself was alive, vibrating with the same force that had ignited the fires in the forest. At the far end of the cave, Tom saw something, an altar of sorts made of ancient stone. The symbols carved into it were the same as those he had seen before, the same markings as the ones on the stone he carried. The patterns seemed to glow faintly in the dark, an eerie blue light emanating from within the stone structure. Tom stepped forward, his hand reaching out instinctively. The moment his fingers brushed against the stone, a jolt of energy shot through him, sending a shockwave of heat and power through his body. He staggered back, his heart racing, as visions began to flood his mind. The fire, the earth, the sky. The flames were not just a natural disaster. They were a manifestation of the land's fury, a reaction to the harm humanity had inflicted upon it. But there was something more, something deeper. Tom's mind raced as the visions became clearer. He saw images of his ancestors, of Galen, the man whose name had appeared in the letter, standing before the very same altar, performing some sort of ritual. It was a ritual of balance, meant to keep the elemental forces of nature in check. But something had gone wrong. The balance had been broken, and now the fire was spreading, uncontrollable and relentless. As the visions faded, Tom collapsed to his knees, gasping for breath. The shock had left him shaken, but the truth was undeniable. The fire was not just a disaster. It was a consequence of something far larger. The land had been disturbed, and now it was fighting back. "We have to stop it," Tom said, his voice hoarse. "But I don't know how. We've been feeding the flames, Rick. Everything we've done has pushed it closer to the surface." Rick stood frozen, his eyes wide with disbelief. "How do we fix this? How can we stop something like this?" Tom didn't have the answers, but he knew one thing. He couldn't do it alone. The fire was too powerful, too ancient. It wasn't just a natural disaster. It was a force of nature, a living entity, and it was angry. "We need to find the key," Tom said, his voice steady despite the chaos around him. "There's something here, something my ancestors left behind, a way to restore balance. If we can find it, we can stop the fire." But as they turned to leave the cave, the ground beneath them trembled. A low rumble echoed through the stone, followed by a deafening roar. The fire had reached the foot of the mountain. It was coming for them. The wrath of nature had been awakened, and it wouldn't be easy to stop. Tom's heart raced as he and Rick made their way back down the mountain, the weight of the knowledge they had uncovered pressing down on him. The fire had spread beyond control. The ground trembled beneath them, as if the earth itself was buckling under the force of the flames. As they descended, the air grew thick with smoke, stinging his eyes and making it difficult to breathe. It felt as though the world itself was suffocating, and Tom couldn't shake the feeling that he was running out of time. They had uncovered the truth, but what good was the truth if they couldn't stop the fire in time? He pulled his phone from his pocket, hoping for any sign of a signal. He had to reach Lily. He had to hear her voice. The thought of her, of his daughter, kept him grounded, kept him fighting against the relentless pull of despair. When the screen lit up, Tom exhaled a sigh of relief. He quickly pressed the dial button, his hands trembling slightly. The line rang twice before it connected. "Dad?" Lily's voice came through the receiver, soft but filled with concern. "Dad, Are you okay? What's going on? I saw the news and I'm scared. Tom swallowed hard, fighting the lump in his throat. He had promised Lily that he would always be there, that he would protect her. But now, as the fire raged around him, he was terrified that he wouldn't be able to keep that promise. I'm fine, sweetheart, Tom said, his voice steady despite the chaos swirling around him. Listen to me, okay? I need you to be strong. I need you to trust me. Lily was silent for a moment, the weight of his words sinking in. Dad, you're not coming home, are you? Tom hesitated, his heart aching at the fear in her voice. He wanted to say yes. He wanted to tell her that everything would be fine, that he would be home soon, and they would go back to their normal life. But he couldn't. No, honey, I can't. Not yet, he said quietly. There's something I have to do. Something big. But I'm going to fix this, I promise. I'm going to stop the fire. Tears welled up in his eyes as he spoke, and he had to fight to keep his composure. Lily had been through so much already. He couldn't bear the thought of losing her, of failing her like he had failed his wife. Please, Dad, don't do anything crazy. Please don't leave me. Lily's voice broke, the raw emotion in her words sending a sharp pain through Tom's chest. I won't leave you, Lily, he whispered, his voice filled with determination. But I have to do this. It's the only way to keep you safe. The only way to stop this fire before it destroys everything. He could hear the soft sobs on the other end of the line, and his heart shattered. He had never wanted to be apart from her. He had never wanted to be in this position, where the world seemed to be falling apart around them. But there was no turning back now. I love you, sweetheart, he said, the words carrying all the weight of his heart. You're my everything, and I will come back to you. I promise. I love you too, Dad. Her voice was barely a whisper, but the love and fear in it were unmistakable. Tom closed his eyes for a moment, the sound of her voice ringing in his ears. It gave him strength, a reason to keep going. He wasn't just fighting for the people in this town, for the forests, or even for himself. He was fighting for her, for Lily. As he ended the call, he looked over at Rick, who had been silently watching him. The guilt in Rick's eyes was undeniable. Tom could see that his old friend knew how much was at stake, how much was riding on Tom's success. We're running out of time, Rick said, his voice strained. The fire's spreading faster than we thought. If we don't find a way to stop it soon. I know, Tom interrupted, his voice hard with resolve. We don't have time for regrets or second-guessing. We have to finish what we started. Rick nodded, but Tom could see the unease in his eyes. He could see the fear, not for himself, but for what was to come. They were walking into the heart of the storm, and this time, there might not be a way out. We'll find a way, Tom said, more to himself than to Rick. We'll stop it. But as they continued their descent, the fire wasn't the only thing that loomed over them. The knowledge of what it would take to stop it, the sacrifice, the cost, hung heavily in the air. Tom couldn't help but wonder if he would make it out of this alive. And if he didn't, he wondered what Lily would think of him. The fire wasn't just a force of nature, it was a test of everything Tom had ever believed in, a test of how far he was willing to go to protect the people he loved. And he would go as far as he had to. The sound of the crackling flames filled the air, mingling with the sharp, acrid scent of smoke that burned in Tom's nostrils. He and Rick pushed through the thickening smoke as they neared the base of the mountain, the fire closing in from all sides. The sun was obscured behind a blanket of ash, casting an eerie, unnatural glow over the land. Time was slipping away faster than Tom had hoped. His mind was a whirlwind of plans, possibilities, and fears. He had uncovered the secret. The fire wasn't a random act of nature. It was a response to the land's damage, a reaction to mankind's greed. But stopping it wasn't going to be simple. It wasn't just about extinguishing flames. It was about restoring balance. And he didn't know if he had enough time left to do it. Tom glanced at Rick, his gaze hardening. We need to warn the authorities. Now. Rick hesitated, looking around nervously. The fire's already spreading too fast. If we don't act soon, we'll be trapped. We won't make it out alive, Tom. I'm not going to let it destroy everything, Tom snapped. The people need to know what's really happening. They need to understand that this isn't just a wildfire. It's a wake-up call, a warning. Rick's face tightened with doubt, but he didn't argue. He knew Tom was right. The fire wasn't just threatening homes and wildlife. It was threatening everything they knew about nature's balance, and it was going to take more than just firefighters to stop it. Tom fumbled for his phone, his fingers slick with sweat. When he finally got a signal, he quickly dialed the number for the local emergency response team. As the phone rang, he could feel his pulse quicken, anxiety gnawing at his insides. "Come on," he muttered under his breath. "Pick up." After what seemed like an eternity, a voice answered. "Emergency response, this is Sarah. How can I help you?" "Sarah, this is Tom Hank, fire rescue." "You need to listen to me carefully," Tom said, trying to keep his voice steady despite the chaos surrounding him. "This fire, it's not what you think. It's not just a forest fire. It's something much bigger. It's being fueled by a force from deep within the earth. We've disturbed the land, and now it's fighting back." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Tom could hear the sound of someone shuffling papers, then a voice crackled through again. "Tom, I'm not sure I understand. A force from the earth? Are you saying this is some kind of—" "Look, I don't have time to explain everything in detail right now," Tom cut in, his frustration mounting. "The fire's spreading faster than anyone could predict. If we don't act soon, it will reach the town in hours. The fire is alive. Its source is something far more dangerous than anything we've dealt with before." Another pause. Sarah was processing his words, but Tom knew she didn't fully grasp the gravity of the situation. "Tom, we're doing everything we can," Sarah said finally. "But if you're saying the fire is alive, we need proof. Can you give us something we can use to understand what's happening?" Tom's mind raced. He thought of the cave, the ancient altar, and the secrets he had uncovered. He thought of the map, the letter from his ancestor. They were the only proof he had, but no one would believe him without it. "I'll send you the information," he said. "I'll send the map and everything we've found. But you need to act fast. The fire, it's not just a natural disaster. It's tied to something bigger, something the land is trying to tell us. If we don't restore balance, it's going to get worse." "Understood," Sarah replied, her voice now tinged with urgency. "We'll wait for the details, Tom, but you need to get out of there. If the fire's really as bad as you're saying, we're going to need every resource available, and we'll need you back at headquarters." "I can't," Tom said firmly. "I'm not leaving until I make sure this fire is stopped. I can't run away from this. Not again." Without waiting for a response, he ended the call. He stood there for a moment, breathing heavily, his gaze fixed on the horizon where the smoke was now a thick, dark wall. The wind had picked up, and the flames seemed to dance higher with each passing minute, as if they were beckoning him toward them. Rick, who had been watching Tom closely, finally spoke. "You're really going through with this, huh?" Tom nodded, his jaw set in determination. "I have to. If I don't, this fire will consume everything: people, wildlife, the land itself. It's not just about putting out the flames. It's about stopping what's causing them. We can't just keep running from this." Rick hesitated before speaking again. "What's the plan then? What do we do?" "We head toward the heart of the fire," Tom said, his voice resolute. "That's where we'll find the source. That's where we can restore balance. But we have to move quickly. We can't waste any more time." As they made their way toward the heart of the blaze, Tom's mind turned back to Lily. He thought about the promise he had made her. He thought about her bright eyes and the way her voice had cracked when she begged him not to go. The weight of his love for her and the promise to protect her was a constant presence in his heart. And he knew, deep down, that whatever it took, he would find a way to keep her safe. But first, he had to stop the fire. He had to make sure that this warning, this force from the earth, would never again threaten the world they knew. The air was thick with smoke, stinging Tom's eyes and making each breath feel like an effort. The crackling of the fire sounded like the world itself was coming undone as the flames surged and roared around them. Tom and Rick pushed forward, determined to reach the source of the fire, where they believed they could finally end it all. The map had led them this far. Now, they were close, closer than ever to the truth. Tom's mind raced with the weight of the decision he knew was coming. The fire wasn't just something they could put out with water and foam. It was a living, breathing entity now, a force of nature tied to the land itself. And the only way to stop it, to restore the balance, was to activate the system his ancestors had set in place centuries ago. But there was a catch. Tom had discovered that the system, a series of ancient fire breaks and natural barriers designed to stop fires in their tracks, would require a sacrifice. The mechanism could only be triggered by a person willing to stand at its center, activating it by hand. A person who would be trapped in the blaze. A person who might never escape. Tom knew that it could only be him. As they neared the heart of the fire, the flames seemed to grow more intense, as if they were sensing their presence. The air grew hotter, and the ground beneath their feet seemed to tremble. Every step was a fight against the storm of destruction that raged around them. "We're almost there," Tom said, his voice steady but strained. He could feel the heat now, his skin burning with each passing moment. "Stay close." Rick, his face grim, nodded but didn't speak. The truth hung between them, the unspoken reality that Tom was leading them both into the heart of danger. He knew what Tom was planning. He knew it was a one-way trip. "I'll stay with you until the end," Rick said quietly, as if reading Tom's mind. "But I'm not letting you do this alone." Tom looked at his friend, a flicker of gratitude passing through his eyes. "You don't have to, Rick. This isn't your fight. It's mine." Rick shook his head. "I'm not letting you walk into this fire alone. We've been through too much." Tom's heart swelled with affection for his old friend. Rick had always had his back, through thick and thin. But this wasn't something that could be shared. This was Tom's burden to bear, and he would carry it alone if it meant saving the world. They reached the center of the fire's path, the heat unbearable now, like standing in the mouth of a furnace. Before them stood a large stone structure, an ancient mechanism, covered in moss and fire-scorched wood. It was a relic, a forgotten piece of history, but it was the key to stopping everything. Tom took a deep breath, his fingers brushing the map in his pocket. This was it, the moment he had been dreading, but also the moment he knew he had to face. "I'll activate the system," Tom said, his voice calm and sure. "It'll stop the fire, but I won't make it out." Rick stared at him, a flash of disbelief in his eyes. "No, Tom, you don't have to do this. We can figure something else out." Tom shook his head, his jaw clenched. "There's no other way. I have to do this. For Lily. For everyone. This is the only chance to stop the fire for good." Rick opened his mouth to argue, but Tom held up a hand, silencing him. "I'm not asking for your approval, Rick. I'm telling you what needs to be done." Tom stepped toward the stone structure, his heart heavy with the weight of the decision. He could feel the heat radiating off the flames surrounding them, and he knew that time was running out. The fire was close now, so close it seemed to reach out and pull at him. He reached out to touch the stone mechanism, and as his fingers made contact, the system sprang to life. The earth beneath them rumbled, and the air crackled with energy. A deep, resonating hum filled the space, and the fire seemed to recoil, as if recognizing the force that had been awakened. But it wasn't enough yet. Tom had to trigger the final mechanism himself. He stepped into the center of the structure, feeling the heat of the fire at his back, the flames licking at his clothes. "I'm sorry, Lily," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I love you. I always will." With a deep breath, Tom pushed the lever that would activate the system. The moment he did, a violent tremor shook the ground. The air exploded with energy, and a wave of heat blasted outward, knocking him off his feet. The ground split open, releasing a torrent of water that surged toward the flames. The fire, which had been advancing relentlessly, began to retreat, as if pushed back by an invisible force. The flames shrank away from the water, their fierce energy being absorbed by the earth, restoring balance. But Tom was too close to the center of it all. As the system activated, a massive wall of fire erupted around him, sealing him in. His body was thrown back by the force of the explosion, but his mind was focused on one thing, one person, Lily. He could hear her voice in his head, a soft whisper of love and fear. He thought of her face, of her smile, of the way she had looked at him the last time they spoke. He thought of the promise he had made. Tom had given everything. He had sacrificed himself to save her, to save them all. As the fire surrounded him, his vision blurred. The world seemed to fade away, but in that moment, he felt at peace. He had done what needed to be done, and for the first time in a long while, Tom Hank knew that he had truly saved something. The fire was gone. The roar of the flames, the choking smoke, the scorching heat, it all disappeared as quickly as it had come. The land, which had been ravaged by the wild fury of nature, now lay in a quiet, uneasy calm. The earth, the trees, the homes, everything was scorched, but the worst was over. The fire had been extinguished, and the balance had been restored. But for the people who had lived through the terror, the aftermath would be just as painful. Lily stood on the outskirts of the fire-ravaged area, her eyes scanning the horizon, searching for a sign that everything would be okay. Her heart ached, a dull, persistent pain that she didn't know how to escape. The man who had promised to protect her, to come home safe, was gone. Her father, the hero who had fought against impossible odds to save their world, was never coming back. She stood alone, her small frame dwarfed by the towering trees that had once stood tall, now charred stumps in the aftermath of the blaze. The air was still thick with the scent of ash, but Lily breathed deeply, trying to steady herself. It wasn't easy. She had lost so much in so little time. The community had already begun to rebuild. The firefighters, the rescue teams, the volunteers, they were all working tirelessly to restore what had been lost. But there was a hole in the heart of everything, a hole that no amount of rebuilding could fill. Her father was gone, and Lily didn't know how to live without him. The memorial service for Tom Hank had been held the day before. The whole town had gathered in a somber ceremony, paying their respects to the man who had given his life to save them all. There had been tears, there had been speeches, there had been stories of his bravery and selflessness. But for Lily, it all felt distant, empty. Nothing could replace the feeling of her father's presence. But she had to try. With a trembling hand, Lily pulled out the letter from the box, the one her father had found before the fire had begun. The letter, written by his ancestor, had revealed the deep, ancient connection between their family and the land. The legacy of sacrifice, of protecting the balance of nature, was more than just a story. It was a truth that her father had lived by. She unfolded the paper carefully, her fingers shaking. As she read the words, a sense of peace began to settle in her heart. The flames may consume us, but the love we leave behind will endure. In the ashes, there is life. In the sacrifice, there is salvation. Lily blinked away the tears that stung her eyes. Her father had saved them all. He had sacrificed everything to stop the fire, to ensure that their world would survive. And though he was gone, his love, the love he had always shown her, was still with her. It lived in the lessons he had taught her, in the way he had made her feel safe, in the strength he had shown in the face of danger. Lily smiled through her tears, a bittersweet sense of pride filling her chest. She wasn't alone. Her father's love was with her, and it always would be. As she stood there, looking over the charred remains of the forest and the town, she knew one thing for certain. The fight wasn't over. The fire had been stopped, but there would always be more to protect, more to save. And she would be ready, because she had learned from the best. She tucked the letter into her jacket pocket and turned to face the town. There was work to be done, but she knew, deep down, that no matter how hard the road ahead might be, she wouldn't be walking it alone. Tom Hank had left her a legacy of love, sacrifice, and courage. And now, it was her turn to carry it forward. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting the world in a warm, golden glow. The town was slowly recovering. People were rebuilding their homes, tending to their crops, and taking stock of what had been lost. It wasn't easy, but the spirit of the community had never been stronger. They had all survived the fire, thanks to Tom, thanks to the man who had given everything to save them. Lily stood outside her home, staring at the stars that had begun to emerge in the night sky. She clutched the letter her father had written, the letter she had read every day since the fire had ended. She had learned something from it, something important. Her father had taught her that love was stronger than any force of nature. It could withstand fire. It could withstand loss. And no matter how far apart she and her father were, his love would never fade. Lily smiled softly, a quiet tear slipping down her cheek. She had lost so much, but she had gained something, too, a strength that she hadn't known she possessed. The flames may have taken her father, but his love had saved them all. And now, Lily would carry that love forward, always.